And they didn't tend to need a standing army during peacetime. They'd raise an army if they were attacked, but during peacetime they didn't need a standing army. So then they run into this problem, the Barbary pirates. And so John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, in 1786, they go to negotiate with a AAA envoy to Britain, Ambassador Sidi Hadji. Under the subject of their inquiry was concerning the grounds of pretension to make war upon nations that had done them no injury. And so, whatever your conflict is with Europe, we're not part of Europe. We're a separate entity. We want to mind our own business. We want peaceful trade, commerce with all nations. So basically, we don't have a beef with you. You shouldn't have a beef with us. And this was the answer. It was written in their Koran that all nations which had not acknowledged the prophet were sinners, whom it was a right and a duty of the faithful to plunder and enslave, and had every Muslim who was slain in this warfare was sure to go to paradise. He said that also a man who was first to board a vessel had one slave over above his share, and that he would sprung to the deck of the enemy's ship. Every sailor had a dagger in his hand and a third in his mouth, which usually struck terror into any foe, that they cried out for quarter at once. So basically their argument was that you're an infidel. You haven't acknowledged Muhammad, and submitted to that. The term Islam means submission, and a Muslim is he who submits. Now, whether or not these people are there's an argument within modern day Muslims as to whether or not submission means personal submission to Allah or submission to his agents, and whether or not jihad is something that was meant at a specific time a long time ago, or is what it. So I'm not going to get into that because I'm not an Arabic scholar, but there are certain elements within the Muslim world who interpret this as an injunction that is relevant for all time, not just back at a certain time. And so they're following on this injunction, and they're pointing to certain verses in the Quran. And they're saying that this is relevant for here and for now, and is a guide to our character, to our behavior. And so, the Jefferson and these guys, they were flabbergasted. Jefferson even went so far as to get himself a copy of the Quran and started reading it through. And he's, oh my God, because he found all these verses in there. Now, whether or not they apply for today, or, that's another question, but he found, yes, it does say that. And so Jefferson realized that this idea that you could simply mind your own business and engage in peaceful commerce and trade and entangle alliances was not possible in the face of a totalitarian threat. A totalitarian threat that has an ideology that it wants to expand is going to attack you simply because you are an infidel or you are not of that ideology. We've run into, and this is just one example. You have other Nazism, whatever. A totalitarian entity is not going to leave you alone simply because you mind your business. They had saw wars and stuff like that. They came about because of the conflict of national interests. National interest bumping up against national interest, the assertion of will, and it wasn't ideologically driven. And so they had come to the conclusion the way to keep out of war is to peaceful trade among all nations, the commerce, and the you don't entangle yourself as an alliance with other nations, because then you get brought into their interest. And so that's why, but in this sense, he proposed an alliance with the European nations. So they wanted to avoid entangling alliance, but in this case, he did propose an alliance with the European nations. He found out that they were more interested in paying the tribute, the more powerful ones. The reason why is because it was easier, it was financially more beneficial for them to pay the tribute than it was, because they could afford the tribute, then a lot of other nations could not. And so the shipping, commercial ventures of other nations was impacted. So the powerful nations that could afford the tribute, that's a small price to pay to have these other competitions wiped out. So these nations, England and France, they didn't want to do anything about this. And Jefferson was flabbergasted, and for a while America was still paying the tribute. And he finally, it was this impetus that eventually changed his mind about it, and they created the Navy and the Marines. And that's where you get this from the whole, to the shores of Tripoli, where you get that the anthem of the Marines. That's where it comes from. And so they fought this battle in against the Barbary pirates, who considered themselves mujahideen, who were engaged in jihad. Sound familiar? The more things change, the more things stay the same. So they recognized this, and they realized that, okay, we want peace, but in the face of a totalitarian threat, we need to defend ourselves in an aggressive sense. And, we need to put a stop to their ability to do this. It's not just a defense. You need to. And then when they did this, they went after not just the Barbary pirates themselves, which were kind of like the Al-Qaeda. They were non-state actors. They went after the supporting nations that supported them as well. And this is an argument that people had been making in the War on Terror. You go after the terrorists, but you have to go after the supporting nations to support them as well. And so some have argued that, well, this is not in conjunction with our founding principles. Yeah, it's almost the same exact situation we had at the time of the Barbary pirates. So we fought this war, and they won. And so you had roughly around 1815 and stuff like that. And eventually, the raiding of the ships stopped, and then you had Christian missionaries started to go out to the Middle East, and they continued something that had been going on for quite a while. The sharing of the ideas that gave rise to our experiment in ordered liberty across the ocean had been going on for a while. I mean, the Pilgrims and the Puritans and the Quakers had been sharing their ideas across the Atlantic well before the Revolution. The Declaration of Independence we sent out to the world. There was a communication going on about our ideas to the world at large, and that communication, these ideas were starting to gain an audience overseas in Europe. And then during the 19th century, eventually you started to have political pilgrimages to America. The first was Alexis de Tocqueville, French historian. He wrote Democracy in America. Then you had Lord Acton, the British historian, which the Acton Institute is named after. Then you had Abraham Kuyper, who was a Dutch theologian and political figure. And they had come to America, and they considered a political pilgrimage to study this idea of ordered liberty and try to export it back to Europe. And you had correspondences with people like Jefferson and Patrick Henry and Thomas Paine. And Thomas Paine was corresponding a lot with the people who started the French Revolution. That's another story. So the ideas of liberty were spreading, but all of a sudden it's kicked into hyperdrive, because you have this, with the succession of the boarding of these ships, now you have an expansion of travel and trade and all this stuff like this, and you have these missionary efforts that are being sent overseas. There's a book called Power, Faith, and Fantasy by a gentleman named Michael B. Oren, and he talks, a big thick book, talks about our relationships with the Middle East from the colonial times up until the present. But there's a section in there where it talks about the missionary societies during the 1800s going over to the Middle East. Threefold purpose. One, obviously, they're Christian missionaries. They want to convert people to the gospel and become Christians. Two, they wanted to attract the Jewish people back to their ancestral homeland, their biblical homeland. But the place was desolate. So their idea was, okay, if we can make a desert, the desert bloom, then it will be such an attraction that the chosen people will come back to their homeland, and then you're going to have this, peace with all these people, and probably everybody will become Christian. But that's another.